Acts of the Apostles, Chapter 14, Lesson 15. In studying this chapter, 1. To continue tracing the route of Paul and Barnabas on their missionary journey. 2. To note the increasing persecution endured by the Apostle Paul, cf. 2 Timothy 3:10-11. And 3. To give special attention to their appointment of elders in every church. Luke continues his narration of events during Paul's first missionary journey. Upon arriving in Iconium, Paul and Barnabas again visited the local synagogue. Response to their message was positive among both Jews and Greeks, but soon opposition again came from unbelieving Jews. Acts 14:1-2. It happened in Iconium that they entered together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spoke that a great multitude, both of Jews and Greeks, believed. But the disbelieving Jews stirred up and embittered the souls of the Gentiles against the brothers. Even so, Paul and Barnabas stayed a long time in Iconium, speaking boldly and performing signs and wonders. Eventually, the opposition became violent, forcing Paul and Barnabas to flee to Lystra and Derbe. Acts 14:3-6. Therefore they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who testified to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided, part sided with the Jews, and part with the apostles. When some of both of the Gentiles and the Jews, with their rulers, made a violent attempt to mistreat and stone them, they became aware of it and fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra, Derbe, and the surrounding region. In Lystra, Paul healed a man crippled from birth, similar to Peter, cf. 3:1-10. The people assumed that Paul and Barnabas must be gods, and so named them Zeus, Barnabas, and Hermes, Paul. Acts 14:7. There they preached the gospel. At Lystra a certain man sat, impotent in his feet, a cripple from his mother's womb, who never had walked. He was listening to Paul speaking, who, fastening eyes on him, and seeing that he had faith to be made whole, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." He leaped up and walked. When the multitude saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the language of Lycaonia, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." They called Barnabas Jupiter and Paul Mercury, because he was the chief speaker. When the priest of Zeus prepared to offer sacrifices, the apostles tore their own clothes and barely restrained them by an impassioned speech. Acts 14:13-15. The priest of Jupiter, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, and would have made a sacrifice along with the multitudes. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their clothes and sprang into the multitude, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to the living God, who made the sky and the earth and the sea, and all that is in them." Acts 14:16-18, who in the generations gone by allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he didn't leave himself without witness, in that he did good and gave you rains from the sky and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. Even saying these things, they hardly stopped the multitudes from making a sacrifice to them. Not long after, Jews from Antioch and Iconium persuaded the multitudes to stone Paul and drag him outside the city. Though assumed to be dead, Paul was able to return to the city and departed the next day with Barnabas to Derbe, where they preached the gospel and made many disciples. Acts 14:19-20. But some Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing he was dead. But as the disciples stood around him, he rose up and entered into the city. On the next day he went out with Barnabas to Derbe. From Derbe, Paul and Barnabas retraced their steps, strengthened the disciples in Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, Pisidia, and appointed elders in every church with prayer and fasting. Acts 14:21-23. When they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, confirming the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and that through many afflictions we must enter into the kingdom of God. When they had appointed elders for them in every assembly, and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord, on whom they had believed. Passing through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia, where they preached the gospel in Perga. From there they went down to Attalia, and then sailed to Antioch, Syria, from which they began their journey, where they reported to the church all that God had done with them. They stayed there for a long time. Acts 24 through 28. They passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. When they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. From there they sailed to Antioch, from where they had been committed to the grace of God for the work which they had fulfilled. When they had arrived and had gathered the assembly together, they reported all the things that God had done with them, and that he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. They stayed there with the disciples for a long time. Acts of the Apostles, chapter 14, lesson 15, the end.